Greetings, fencers. So this is the follow-up video to the previous one I made about teaching HEMA to beginners. So I'm going to split it into 4 parts: goals, movement, structure, and mentality. And so this is sort of my training method starting off, because definitely some people might be able to relate to it. Maybe it'll help you out, and especially now with a lot of clubs not being open, some people might be forced into that situation. So if you don't know, I started off without a club. Still just we just have a really small group, and I really only got to spar once a week, once every 2 weeks. It really wasn't that often, just against 1 or 2 other people, and just for like an hour. So my first year of practice was very little sparring, and then I went to one of the more internationally known tournaments in Canada, and got 3rd in open longsword.
He is actually from, he's like only up here by himself, and from what I understood, from what I gathered, was mostly self-taught. We got to judge him in the eliminations. It was really pleasurable to watch.
So this is just kind of to sort of share that even if you don't have a big club, you don't have an instructor, you can still learn HEMA. It's not the end of the world. You are still able to put the time in and do it. So this is something that I mentioned a little bit in my previous video, but about goals, because I think that's one of the biggest things, especially with a reconstructed martial art. If you don't have a goal, how are you able to build up this martial art? Because we don't have someone directly telling us what to do. So you really need to have goals and expectations in your mind. They will change and adapt over time, and as you learn more, they will grow. But it's very important to set long-term goals, short-term goals about every aspect of fencing if you're wanting to take this seriously. So knowing what you want to get out of HEMA, what do you want to be able to accomplish? Do you want to compete? Do you want to just practice different weapon systems? Do you want to just practice martial arts? Do you just want form? Whatever you want to get out of it, have that in your head. Know what you're wanting to accomplish, and that goes for long-term goals. If you're wanting to compete at high-level tournaments, or just stuff around where you are, to your fitness. Are you wanting to be able to do multiple exchanges without losing stamina? Keeping to set that higher and higher. Are you wanting to be able to cut with strength in specific ways that you haven't been able to do? Are you wanting to use specific techniques in fencing? One of the common ones is using your crossed arm position. Are you wanting to be able to set that as a goal to accomplish all these little parts, small and big goals? And what do you want your fencing to look like? That's the biggest thing. I have a very clear goal of what I want to look like, and that's something that I've developed over time. I do not have a question in my mind of what I want my fencing to look like. It has changed over time, but I have a very clear expectation and goal of how I want my movements to look, and I'm not going to stop until they look that well. I fail all the time in fencing videos. In my sparring videos, I can see that I don't reach that many times, but I'm still trying to reach that, and I'm happy when I do, and I see that my structure and movement is my goal and what I'm wanting to do. And so looking at other clubs, other HEMA practitioners, will help you sort of narrow down, because again, we don't get to see people using swords in real life, so we don't really have a clear idea of what our goals should be starting off, and that's why it's important for us to make those, because they will shape how your fencing looks. And you will meet people with different goals. Goals can be right for you and wrong for someone else, and vice versa. If you see your goals as the only way, you're going to be a jerk and no one's going to like you. So you have to find this sort of understanding of, you need to see your goals as right, because if you don't think they're right, you're not really going to be committed to your goals and expectations of fencing and be able to train hard for them. But you need to understand and have that in the back of your head that it's not necessarily going to be right for everyone. We see different ways that stuff is done. An example that I'll give historically is we see the thumb on the blade on saber. I didn't bring my sabers out. We see the thumb on the spine for saber fencing, and so we see that given in a lot of British military saber. They say it's fine. You can do it, or you can choose not to do it. Whatever your goals are in fencing, you can do that. I have a specific German saber source from the 1800s that he says, don't do that, for your cuts will be weaker and you're more likely to hurt your thumb and have it hurt for the rest of your sparring time, in which case you'll have to stop for a bit. And so we see two people with different goals, and neither is right or wrong. They just have different ideas on how they want their fencing to look like. And so generally my personal preference is I don't really like using the thumb on the blade. It changes how I have to cut and how I have to mullinet and rotate. So I generally go with the German idea of, it's everywhere, but specifically this German fencing master, of keeping the thumb on. That way I can clamp it down and I can loosen up on the other fingers, because it changes what you do. This way your fingers have to stay on when you mullinet. So that's a historical example of two different goals. They're not right or wrong, they just have certain advantages and disadvantages. And depending on the overall goals of what people are wanting their fencing to look like, they might not be very compatible. I've met people who our fencing just really doesn't connect, because after talking to the people afterwards, we have completely different views on historical fencing and what we're trying to accomplish. And so, if it's so different, we won't really enjoy sparring with each other, but it's good to get out of your comfort zone. But know that, yes, there are different ideas, and so you need to find out for yourself what your ideas and goals are in historical fencing. What are you trying to accomplish? So, coming into sort of the three pillars, movement, structure, and mentality. I'm going to give examples of what I trained, how I trained them, what my ideas and interpretations were behind choosing them, because I didn't have an instructor. It was just me and a couple of my friends, childhood friends, that just were willing to get beat up with swords, and so they would learn along with me a bit, but they weren't as committed. They weren't trying to do this sort of full time. And some examples of different interpretations of different choices and why I specifically chose to do something. Because I didn't have an instructor, I had to deliberately look at what I want it to be, what I want it to look like, how I want all my movements. Okay, so further back so you can see my feet. One of the biggest foundational and just priority goals of mine is one of Lichtauer's sayings, "He who lies still is dead, he who keeps moving is still alive." And so he gives this in the guard section, and I apply it to just all movement. So if I stop moving, I'm dead, kind of thing. And that's how I look at it drastically. Movement will look different for different people, but I want to make sure that I am not doing two sword movements without a step. I've done this many times in sparring where I can easily just block and hit the guy, and I still see that as a failed exchange when I look at the video footage after, because I was not following my goals of what I want fencing to look like, of how I want to force myself to train and continue being better. Because when I'm sparring, the goal isn't to win, the goal is to get better. So I want to make sure I'm continuously moving. So all drills that I would do, I want just always continuous movement in the drills. I would have people just call out a guard and a cut, and I'd just be moving back and forwards. Just doing the different steps and every drill. So I put a couple specific examples of footwork drills that we do in the beginner video, and I'm always making sure that no matter what drill I'm doing, I'm always stepping off to the side, and I'm always moving and doing whatever I need to do to keep my feet in motion, and so I'm not staying still. A couple specifics with my footwork. So I very quickly learned that if I want to have my full force in the cut, I want to be leaning over my front leg. I don't want to lean over and then cut, I want to be coiled like a spring. This leg is ready to pounce at the exact moment. I remember my foot was so sore after my first tournament because this leg was tense the whole time and just ready to push off the whole time. So I have it completely ready to go. The reason for that is the leg with the least amount of weight is what can move the fastest. If I put all my weight on my front leg, this leg can move freely. If I put all my weight on my back leg, this leg can move freely. I try and experiment and use all of them in fencing, making sure to use medium stances, using back weighted, and using front weighted, and always changing it up and experimenting. But my default, if I want to win the exchange, my default is the front weighted. So why did this come about? Well, it's because in the German sources, we usually see the passing step being used. He says stepping off to the side with your right foot, etc. It'll be frequently found, although it's not as specific, and so you can have different interpretations of how this goes. If I'm wanting to make the fastest step with my back leg, I want my weight on my front leg, so this goes effortlessly. If I'm like this, I have to push off a little bit with my back leg to get the weight off of it and go. And so these are just subtle things that change how your fencing is going. That being said, is this the only way to do it? Well, no. We very clearly see in Fiore's system, Fiore's favorite guard is all these retracted positions, both with dagger, sword in one hand, boar's tusk. He does this, backwards weighted against his opponent. Why does he do this? Because he wants to move the front foot off the line first. And so we see Fiore teach the opposite. He likes to have the weight off the front leg, so that way he can step first and then make his movement with whatever the technique happens to be. And then the German system, where I do the opposite, where I'm wanting to step off and then the back foot steps off afterwards with the triangle step. And so they accomplish the same thing, it's just a different order. And so there's two different ways that you can start playing with your footwork. Having front weighted so that this foot moves first, or having back weighted so that way your front foot moves first. Whatever it happens to be. So having a pelt that you can actually hit with force is really important if you don't have a partner putting force back at you. If you're scared to hit over your dummy, you're going to not really be committing to those cuts as well. So I have the target, and I would practice my Vorschlag and those first two cuts most of the time. And so I'd be practicing my stance. That way I'm all ready, no tell. If I'm back here and I lean forward first, this is the tell. I don't want this motion. I want to be ready to go from here to make the cut. And then I'm front weighted because I'm not planning on retreating. I'm planning on cutting again with this leg because now this leg doesn't have any weight on it. And that can be done inside or outside, whichever direction you want. I'm continuously making those passing steps. Why do I do that as well? Because the basis in the general teachings of the longsword is Liechnauer talks about stepping with the passing steps. So again, I use all different footwork in my videos, but the passing step is my foundational piece of footwork. And so cutting at your target and making sure you move and get out, that way you're in constant motion. You never want to be stopped, you want to be moving, you want to practice like it's the fight. I was never just standing here and just going boom, 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 boom. I would do that occasionally if I, want to practice the specific technique of a move, but I want to treat it like it's a fight. And going hard, stepping off to the side, whatever it happens to be. constant motion, constantly stepping. Again, with a target, you kind of have to move around it because it's not moving backwards. Or generally an opponent is going to move forwards or backwards and around with you. And so I'd have a target set up in a field. I do have a video going over some of this if you're in my interpretations playlist. I have a target set up in the field, and that way I can freely go around it and practice my footwork unencumbered by a wall. The next pillar. So we have movement, then we have cutting structure, and all your structure in general. So this is where, again, I like using a pel that's strong and hard, a tire, something like that. And again, I don't have an instructor exactly telling me how to do this, so I am just watching videos, trying to find out, okay, how do people put their arms? Who are the people that I like? How their fencing looks? What do they look like? You know, how am I trying to do this? What do the manuscripts specifically say about cutting? And so I'm using all that to try and figure out how do I want to do this. One of the first elements that I focused on was I did not want my wrist overextended. That fits with my goal of what I want fencing to look like. I don't want that. I don't want a long point like this. Some people have it, some people make it work. You can find images of that in manuscripts. So, do people make it work? Yes. We also see images in manuscripts of people specifically not using that. So, either way can work. Again, I'm not going to argue what's right or wrong. This fits with my goal of what I want my fencing to look like. And I do have to specifically watch out with a heavy messer like this. If I cut and if it takes over and pulls my wrist down, I actually can't spar for the rest of the day. So be careful of that. If you do have injuries, you really need to make sure you're cutting with a straight wrist all the way through. With a long sword, generally I can take it because there's a second hand on it, so it's not the end of the world if accidentally my sword gets hit up and I thrust like that. Now, when I'm coming up to spar someone, and if I'm like, I actually want to win this exchange, then I'm wanting to just hew in their head or hew in their body part. I'm wanting to cut all the way through. That's how I'm wanting to hit. I'm not wanting to cut and the cut stop at the point of impact. I do tense up my muscles and make sure that's stopping, but I want my arms to be able to continue moving if it was actually cutting. And so I'm not wanting to make cuts. It's a little bit hard to explain, but I want that if there was nothing there, my arms could continue going through. An example of this is if I were to make a cut number 3, or a right Unterhau, from here, like this. I actually can't continue going up. How I made this cut is stopped there. And so this cut wouldn't actually hew. This is actually interesting because Federico Malaguti, he actually made a video talking about that cut. And, you know, a common mistake for beginners is making that cut poorly to where it wouldn't actually cut. And so you can check out that video, and he made in his 3 beginner mistakes, and he made a follow-up video about Unterhauen and undercuts. So you can check out those videos. But yeah, essentially that's the problem of you're making a cut where the motion doesn't continue through unless I were to do this leverage action with my left hand, which is, I would not really feel comfortable doing that. So instead, you want your cut to be able to go all the way through. You want both your hands moving. You want your hands in the opposite opening to where you're cutting through. That way you're keeping yourself safe. I don't want to cut and have my hands in this lower opening. I want my hands in the opposite opening. So that way I'm safe going through, and this can be done with wrath cut. I don't want the cut to stop where I have to leverage action it down. I want the cut to go all the way through. There's different contexts for different cuts. So, but in general, if I'm wanting to cut at a deep target, which I generally am, I want to make sure that my hands can continue going through the cut. Another good example is the thwart cut. Often the thwart cut, you see people like this. They have the hands more in front of the head to where it can continue going with this leverage action. Instead, I want to make the thwart cut with both my hands on the opposite side. And so this allows me to control the blade, and it goes with my fencing more so than just hitting the side of the head. That being said, people use different ways. And I'm not saying one's right or wrong. this goes with my goal and my view and expectations of how I want my cut to look. I want my hands nice and straight off to the side in my thwart cut. And again, practicing, I like getting the nice feedback from something and making sure I'm practicing with my hips as well. If you're practicing stationary, your hip should be turning inwards to cut as well. And with a thwart cut. And so for drills, again, I'd have targets with arms. It'd be like a cross, and I would be able to cut at each of the openings. And fencing, practicing historical combat, it's not a sprint, it is a marathon. I spent my first year primarily practicing the Vorschlag and that strong passing step continuing attack and cutting to multiple openings. So spending time practicing, okay, how do I cut from all different openings, and spending time practicing just continuously moving while cutting all four openings. So that's how I merged those two together. I wanted that strong cutting structure where my hands are always covering the opposite opening and always continuing through the cut line and continuously moving around. Cutting structure is definitely something that it's good to get feedback hitting someone else holding a sword. It is kind of important. And so you need to get that a little bit. And once you start feeling, okay, how's this work? How's this move? Because I find I've seen a lot of people, they make a thwart cut and they want to go around the sword, and that's why they end up like this with their hands over the head. Because they're trying to, when they come in for the thwart, go around. My vision of the thwart cut and sort of why it shapes how I cut is I want to cut through the sword. My sword is coming up and it's pushing their sword to the side, and I'm going through it instead of going around it. And so looking at all the different elements of how you want to cut and how you want to move and putting them just into all your solo drills and always practicing like it's a fight. Again, if you've never sparred, then you don't know exactly how it goes, but once it's feeling too easy, just put more energy in it. How much you put into a drill is how much you take out of it. No drill is too easy. And so I can cut and then do a low thwart, cutting opposite openings. I can do it like that, and I'll get a lot out of it. Or I can do the same thing. Do the same thing and put a lot more work into it. And then now I'm getting a lot more movement, cardio, and just training out of the same drill. So I'm not just sitting there, just making the cuts. You do that when you need to practice something. But once you want to actually train it like you fight, you have to train like you fight. Otherwise, you're going to come into your fencing just with your regular drills. Because your muscle memory of how you practice is huge. I'll share a story. So the OPP is the Ontario Police. They had an incident, I can't remember if it was with their 6-shooter or their automatic sidearm, but they actually would train picking up the shells after they shoot in their drills and at the range. And so one of these officers got into a shootout, and they were actually picking up the shells mid-shootout because they were instinctively doing how they trained. And so you can find lots of little advice and tips. I know Skyligrim recently uploaded a video where he said, don't give the dagger back to them, because apparently in a tournament someone had drilled where every time they take the dagger, they give it to the person to try again. And so he disarmed the guy and gave him back the dagger instead of getting a point for himself. You need to train like you spar, and that's why when you're cutting, always cut in and exit out. Depending on where your target is, that's easier said than done, or where you ended. And you can use your imagination. What are you trying to accomplish on this target? You can imagine that you're hitting a sword away here, then you're making a thwart cut. Oh, he blocked it, so I cut here, and then I push and slice to the neck, kind of thing. You can put those images into your head. That way, you're continuing doing something. And so you can imagine instead, oh, I hit the sword out of the way, I thwart cut, I cut, and then I block the afterblow kind of thing as you exit. There's all different things you can do to make sure that your training and your cutting practice feels more like sparring, sort of like the shadow boxing concept. And that way you're getting as much out of it as possible. So, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We're trying to learn a whole lifetime of martial arts in HEMA. There's tons of stuff. It's very full. So you shouldn't just be trying to pack yourself full immediately in the first year with all the different techniques throughout the longsword section of the Zettel, because that's primarily what we're focusing on. There's lots of different stuff that you can focus on. And so what I primarily focused on my first year was the strong passing step, a strong Vorschlag, and cutting to the 4 openings. And that was pretty much mostly what I practiced. A little bit of the hangings and thrusting, but did not practice that anywhere near as much as those 3 things. The next year, I practiced different ways for footwork, and I practiced the bind and winding. And next year, I'll practice new elements, and the next year I'll practice new elements. That way I'm getting to have some sort of mastery or skill over the elements that I'm practicing, and I can fully put myself into that concept and understand them and have them as muscle memory reactions, and I'm not trying to stuff too much at once. Save that for another year. And with your drills, I won't explain it in depth because there's tons of videos going through it. You want those triggers, you want it to be muscle memory. You can't think of how I'm going to do it, it's just feeling and doing it. So you really want to understand how triggers work, and you need to understand how action and reaction work and how a fight works. If you're in HEMA for the martial arts side of it and you've really only looked at HEMA stuff, you might be missing a lot, because again, a lot of people coming in HEMA, we start off sort of in the fantasy side. We liked sword fighting, and so we come into it without a martial arts background. I didn't have a martial arts background, so I don't know how a fight works. I don't know how people are going to react, how all that stuff is going to work. But I want to make sure that I actually learned parts of that I learned elements and tried to figure out how that works. And so I've widened my net to making sure that I'm getting advice and information from MMA, BJJ, boxing, and tons of other martial arts that prioritize the fight, because you're going to learn lots of good advice, because not all HEMA instructors have done that. Some have, and they know how a fight works out, but some might not, and you might not if you don't have a martial arts background. So it's important to widen that net and understand how acting and reacting works, how fights work, how people are going to come at you, how all that stuff can play out. So that way you're not just looking at it from a technical side, and looking at also from an emotional side of how people strike at you. In the manuscripts they do state a lot of that, they do explain it, but if you don't really know it already, a lot of that stuff will go over your head. When I go back and read different manuscripts, I get so much more information, and after I learn more, I'll go back to the same manuscript and learn even more information. But if you're not getting it the first time, reading it over and over again won't get it. You need to start learning that stuff. And when you're sparring, it's not about winning. Sparring is a training tool that you're going to use to get better. And so have a goal, even just in every exchange. So sometimes I approach my sparring partner and I'm like, you know what, this exchange, I want to win. Okay, I want to hit them in the head. And so I'm going to try and do that in the exchange. I'm going to try and be my aggressive self that I trust as my muscle memory to win the exchange. Other times, and you'll see this if you watch a lot of my sparring footage from the past year, I'll just spar in long point and just let them try and act. And so I lose a lot more exchanges like that, but I'm practicing feeling and I'm just practicing, okay, how are people going to attack at me? How do I react in such a way that saves me? I'm practicing a skill. I'm putting myself, instead of putting winning first, I'm just trying to practice different elements. And so there's tons of different ways you can approach your sparring like this. You know, some of the basic ones is you can spar left-handed to learn different skills. You can try and do thrust-only sparring. You can do cut-only sparring. Sparring with different gear amounts, at different intensities. Sparring with foam swords with no gear on. And that way you get full motion and you don't have any restrictions. Practicing continuous fencing where you're not stopping because you don't know if the cut's going to stop the person. Practicing multiple opponent fencing so that way you get to move around differently. All these elements help you learn different skill sets, are important to developing you as a full martial artist. And obviously practicing wrestling, practicing sword in one hand and pole weapons, all those are important elements. If you're just learning longsword, you're going to miss a lot of stuff. So yeah, this is sort of a bit of my training, not really the specific drills, but my interpretation and my background of how I started practicing in HEMA. I will be putting a drills video together at some point. That's just a short, 5-second clip of each drill, sort of starting off, because yeah, there's not a ton of those out there. And I know those are helpful. I like finding those videos to find new drills to do. So at some point when I have availability with another person, I'll put one of those together and that'll sort of show how our movement drills work. You can check in the middle of the previous beginner training video to see how we integrate moving and distance management into all of our drills, so that way we're constantly moving. So just wanted to share this because if you're in the same situation as me, putting the time and effort into what you want your fencing to look like, making strong cutting structure and movement a priority, and looking into the details of how every part of your body is moving and picking how do you want this to look, and putting the effort into that. Even if you don't have sparring partners, you can still be doing that and putting the effort how you want your body to move and look. Thanks for watching. Keep studying, keep practicing.
I am really surprised if someone listened to me talk for 33 minutes. So if that was you, here's some embarrassing moments to make it worth it.
Oh, yes! 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 Okay. Oh, okay. Oh! I did it! Oh! Oh no, what's that? No! Nice.